In the spring of 1945, the United States stood at the edge of victory. Across Europe, the war against Nazi Germany was nearing its end. Across the Pacific, American bombers, transports, fighters, tankers, carriers, mechanics, engineers, and factory workers were still driving toward the final defeat of Imperial Japan. But something else had happened during those years. Something quieter. Something that did not end when the guns fell silent. The United States had built not only the greatest air armada the world had ever seen, it had built the foundation of the modern sky. Factories that had once produced cars, appliances, and civilian machinery had learned to produce bombers by the thousands. Engineers had solved problems that had seemed impossible only a decade earlier. Workers had mastered precision production on a scale never before attempted. Pilots had crossed oceans that earlier generations had treated as barriers. Radar operators had learned to see through darkness and weather. Airfields had spread across the map like a new nervous system for the nation. And when the war ended, all of that did not simply disappear. The machines changed. The missions changed. The uniforms came off. But the knowledge remained. The tools remained. The runways remained. The pilots, mechanics, engineers, radio operators, airport planners, and aircraft designers remained. And slowly, the machinery of war became the machinery of peace. The bomber plant became the aircraft plant. The military transport became the airliner. The wartime runway became the civilian airport. The radar scope that once watched for enemy aircraft became a guardian of passenger safety. This is the story of how World War II transformed American aviation, not only in battle, but in everyday life. It is the story of how wartime industry helped create the post-war airline age. And it is the story of how a nation that had learned to build for survival turned that knowledge toward connection, commerce, comfort, and the freedom to cross a continent in hours instead of days. This is the legacy of World War II in the civil aviation of the post-war world. To understand the transformation, we have to remember what aviation looked like before the war. By the late 1930s, aviation was no longer a novelty. Americans had heard the names Lindbergh, Earhart, Boeing, Douglas, Lockheed, Curtiss, and Sikorsky. The airplane had already proven itself. But commercial flight was still limited. It was expensive. It was weather sensitive. It was often noisy, uncomfortable, and restricted to those who could afford it. The great majority of Americans still traveled long distances by train, automobile, or ocean liner. The Douglas DC-3 had already changed domestic air travel before the war. It was reliable, efficient, and profitable in a way earlier airliners had not been. But the wider world of civil aviation still lacked the infrastructure and scale that would make flying a normal part of American life. Airports were not yet the massive transportation hubs we know today. Many were modest fields, with small terminals, limited night operations, and runways that could not handle the heavier aircraft that would soon arrive. Aircraft production itself was still relatively small. Many airplanes were built with extraordinary skill, but not yet with the relentless industrial rhythm that would define wartime America. Factories could produce excellent machines, but they had not yet been asked to produce them in unimaginable numbers. And then came the crisis. In Europe, the German Luftwaffe demonstrated the deadly power of modern air war. In Asia and the Pacific, Japan showed that air power could decide the opening moments of a conflict. The skies were no longer a frontier. They were a battlefield. The United States watched, measured, prepared, and then, after Pearl Harbor, moved with a speed that astonished the world. The question was not simply whether America could build airplanes. The question was whether America could build enough airplanes, fast enough, strong enough, reliable enough, to fight a global war across 2 oceans. That question would reshape American industry. And after the war, the answer would reshape American travel. The phrase "arsenal of democracy" is often used to describe America's wartime production. But in aviation, that phrase becomes almost literal. During World War II, American factories produced aircraft at a scale that would have seemed almost impossible in 1939. The shift was not merely an increase in output. It was a revolution in industrial organization. Before the war, aircraft manufacturing still depended heavily on skilled handwork. Each airplane was a complex machine, and complex machines resisted mass production. A bomber was not a Model T. It had thousands of parts, miles of wiring, hydraulic systems, fuel systems, engines, instruments, control surfaces, radios, turrets, armor, and precision structures that had to survive cold, altitude, turbulence, battle damage, and long missions. Yet the American industrial system adapted. The automobile industry brought lessons from assembly line production. Aircraft companies expanded. New plants were built. Government financing helped create capacity on a scale private industry alone could not have risked. Workers were trained quickly. Women entered factories in huge numbers, becoming an essential part of the wartime labor force. At Willow Run, Ford applied automobile-style production thinking to the B-24 Liberator bomber. At Boeing, the B-17 and B-29 programs demanded unprecedented coordination. At Douglas, Lockheed, North American, Grumman, Republic, Curtiss, and Consolidated, the American aircraft industry became a national machine. This was not easy. Airplanes were complicated. Subcontractors had to be coordinated. Engines had to arrive on time. Aluminum had to be allocated. Tires, radios, instruments, armament, plexiglass, rubber, and machine tools all had to flow into the right plants at the right moment. Every airplane was the visible result of a hidden network. The airframe was only the beginning. Behind it stood mines, mills, foundries, chemical plants, electrical manufacturers, training schools, railroads, trucking companies, test pilots, inspectors, draftsmen, engineers, and thousands of small shops producing parts few civilians would ever see. By 1944, American aircraft production reached its wartime peak. The numbers were staggering. Tens of thousands of aircraft were being delivered in a single year. But the most important legacy was not only the number of airplanes. It was the capability. America had learned how to organize a national aerospace industry. It had learned how to build complex flying machines in quantity. It had learned how to standardize parts, train labor, manage quality, coordinate subcontractors, and integrate scientific research into production. When peace returned, that capability became the industrial foundation of post-war civil aviation. The same nation that had built bombers for Europe and the Pacific could now build airliners for Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, Miami, Honolulu, London, and Paris. War had forced the scale. Peace would inherit it. Every war accelerates technology, but World War II accelerated aviation in almost every direction at once. Aircraft had to fly farther. They had to carry heavier loads. They had to climb higher. They had to survive worse weather. They had to navigate across oceans. They had to operate from rough fields, island bases, desert strips, frozen runways, and crowded military airports. Each demand forced engineers to solve a problem. Long-range bombers required better engines, better fuel systems, better structures, better oxygen systems, and eventually pressurized crew compartments. Transports required reliability, range, cargo capacity, and maintainability. A transport aircraft that could not be repaired quickly was not useful in war. A military supply chain could not wait for fragile machines. Fighters drove improvements in aerodynamics, engine power, metallurgy, cooling, and high-speed flight. Naval aviation forced advances in landing gear, folding wings, corrosion resistance, and rugged airframes. Even failures became valuable. Engines overheated, turbo superchargers failed, propellers vibrated, landing gear collapsed, wings iced over, crews got lost, radios failed. New aircraft were modified again and again until they became mature machines. That cycle of rapid design, testing, failure, correction, and production became one of the hidden legacies of wartime aviation. The B-29 Superfortress is a powerful example. It was one of the most advanced aircraft of the war. It featured pressurized crew areas, remote-controlled gun turrets, long-range, high-altitude performance, and advanced systems for its time. It was expensive, difficult, and complicated. But the knowledge built into it did not vanish after 1945. The same kind of thinking, high-altitude comfort, long-range performance, advanced systems, more powerful engines, pointed directly toward the post-war airliner. Passengers did not need bomb bays or gun turrets. But they did need pressurization. They did need range. They did need safe engines. They did need reliable navigation. They did need aircraft that could cross mountains, oceans, storms, and continents. In that sense, the post-war airliner was not simply a civilian machine. It was a peaceful answer to wartime questions. How do you carry people safely over great distances? How do you fly above the weather? How do you make long flight less exhausting? How do you make a machine strong enough for war, but comfortable enough for families, businessmen, diplomats, servicemen returning home, and Americans beginning to see the world? World War II did not invent every piece of commercial aviation, but it accelerated the arrival of the world that commercial aviation needed. One of the clearest bridges between wartime aviation and post-war civil aviation was the military transport. Bombers won headlines. Fighters became legends. But transports quietly built the habits of global aviation. They carried men, mail, medical supplies, engines, ammunition, fuel, food, spare parts, and government officials. They crossed oceans. They linked continents. They taught crews how to operate long-distance air routes under pressure. The Douglas C-47, military version of the DC-3, became one of the most famous aircraft of the war. It dropped paratroopers, towed gliders, moved cargo, and served in nearly every theater. After the war, thousands of DC-3 and C-47 aircraft helped expand regional and commercial aviation around the world. But the next stage required bigger aircraft. The Douglas C-54 Skymaster, military version of the DC-4, was a four-engine transport that helped prove the practicality of long-range land-based air transport. During the war, C-54s flew demanding routes across the North Atlantic and supported operations in the Pacific and Asia. After the war, the DC-4 and surplus C-54s became workhorses of commercial aviation. They were not as glamorous as later aircraft, but they helped airlines carry more passengers farther than before. Then came the Lockheed Constellation. Sleek, graceful, and powerful, the Constellation represented the romance of the post-war sky. Its origins reached back before America entered the war, but wartime production turned early versions into the C-69 military transport. After the war, converted and newly built Constellations entered commercial service and became symbols of long-distance travel. For many passengers, the Constellation looked like the future. It had the shape of speed. It had the range for serious international routes. It had pressurization, allowing flight above much of the weather. It turned the airline cabin into something closer to a modern experience. And then there was the Boeing Stratocruiser. The Boeing 377 Stratocruiser was derived from the C-97, which itself came from the B-29 lineage. It was large, pressurized, luxurious, and unmistakably post-war. It offered sleeping berths, a spacious cabin, and even a lower-deck lounge. It was not a perfect airplane. Its engines were demanding, and its economics were difficult. But as an artifact of its time, it tells us something important. The post-war airline industry did not emerge from nowhere. It emerged from the machines, factories, engines, structures, and ambitions of wartime aviation. A bomber became a transport became an airliner. A military route became a commercial route. A wartime necessity became a peacetime service. And slowly, the airplane changed from an instrument of national survival into an instrument of national mobility. Aircraft alone do not create an aviation system. An airplane needs a place to land. It needs runways, lighting, hangars, fuel, maintenance, weather reporting, radio communication, navigation aids, baggage handling, passenger buildings, fire crews, mechanics, and trained controllers. During World War II, the United States and its allies built and expanded airfields at a breathtaking pace. Some were temporary, some were crude, some were carved out of coral islands, deserts, farmland, and forests. But the habit of building air infrastructure became permanent. After the war, America faced a new question. What should be done with the aviation capacity created by war? The answer was partly political, partly economic, and partly cultural. The United States had become an air-minded nation. Americans had seen what airplanes could do. Veterans had crossed continents and oceans. Families had followed war news that depended on air campaigns. Communities had hosted training bases and aircraft plants. The airplane was no longer a distant novelty. It was part of national life. In 1946, the Federal Airport Act marked a major step in turning wartime aviation experience into civilian infrastructure. The federal government began supporting airport development in peacetime, recognizing that civil aviation would be part of the nation's future. This mattered. Larger aircraft required better runways. Longer routes required better planning. More passengers required safer terminals and more organized operations. Airlines could not expand if airports remained stuck in the 1930s. The post-war airport became a symbol of American modernity. It was a place where families said goodbye and welcome home. It was where businessmen began to cross the country in a day. It was where soldiers returned, immigrants arrived, and the world became smaller. The airport was no longer just a field. It was a gateway. And many of those gateways existed because war had taught America how essential air infrastructure really was. To understand the transformation, we have to remember what aviation looked like before the war. By the late 1930s, aviation was no longer a novelty. Americans had heard the names Lindbergh, Earhart, Boeing, Douglas, Lockheed, Curtiss, and Sikorsky. The airplane had already proven itself. But commercial flight was still limited. It was expensive. It was weather-sensitive. It was often noisy, uncomfortable, and restricted to those who could afford it. The great majority of Americans still traveled long distances by train, automobile, or ocean liner. The Douglas DC-3 had already changed domestic air travel before the war. It was reliable, efficient, and profitable in a way earlier airliners had not been. But the wider world of civil aviation still lacked the infrastructure and scale that would make flying a normal part of American life. Airports were not yet the massive transportation hubs we know today. Many were modest fields, with small terminals, limited night operations, and runways that could not handle the heavier aircraft that would soon arrive. Aircraft production itself was still relatively small. Many airplanes were built with extraordinary skill, but not yet with the relentless industrial rhythm that would define wartime America. Factories could produce excellent machines, but they had not yet been asked to produce them in unimaginable numbers. And then came the crisis. In Europe, the German Luftwaffe demonstrated the deadly power of modern air war. In Asia and the Pacific, Japan showed that air power could decide the opening moments of a conflict. The skies were no longer a frontier. They were a battlefield. The United States watched, measured, prepared, and then, after Pearl Harbor, moved with a speed that astonished the world. The question was not simply whether America could build airplanes. The question was whether America could build enough airplanes, fast enough, strong enough, reliable enough, to fight a global war across 2 oceans. That question would reshape American industry. And after the war, the answer would reshape American travel. The legacy of wartime aviation was not only mechanical, it was human. World War II trained an enormous population in aviation skills. Pilots learned navigation, radio discipline, weather judgment, instrument flying, formation procedures, emergency management, and long-distance operations. Mechanics learned engines, hydraulics, electrical systems, sheet metal repair, propellers, fuel systems, inspection, and troubleshooting under pressure. Engineers learned to move from drawing board to prototype to production faster than ever before. Controllers learned the language of traffic, sequencing, separation, and communication. Factory workers learned precision. Managers learned logistics. Meteorologists learned how deeply weather shaped flight. And after the war, many of these people carried their knowledge into civilian life. Some became airline pilots. Some became mechanics. Some became airport managers. Some became engineers in the new aerospace economy. Some became teachers, inspectors, entrepreneurs, or executives. Others simply became citizens who understood aviation in a way earlier generations had not. This mattered for public confidence. A nation that had sent sons, brothers, fathers, and neighbors into the air during war was more prepared to trust the airplane in peace. A man who had flown in a C-47, serviced a B-17, navigated a bomber, or worked in a stateside aircraft plant did not see aviation as magic. He saw it as machinery. Difficult machinery, yes. Dangerous if neglected, yes. But understandable, maintainable, improvable. That attitude helped aviation become ordinary, and making aviation ordinary may have been one of the greatest achievements of the post-war era. The miracle of flight became a scheduled departure. The heroic machine became a family trip. The wartime pilot became the airline captain. The mechanic who kept bombers flying became the mechanic who kept passengers safe. In that human continuity, the legacy of World War II lived on every time an airliner lifted its wheels from an American runway. After the war, Americans were ready to move. The country had changed. Families had been separated. Veterans came home. Business expanded. The economy grew. The middle class strengthened. Americans had new expectations about distance, time, and mobility. Before the war, a cross-country trip could feel like a major undertaking. After the war, the idea of crossing the continent by air became increasingly practical. Airlines promoted speed, comfort, modernity, and national connection. The aircraft were not yet jets, but they were far beyond the fragile airliners of the early years. The DC-4, DC-6, Constellation, Super Constellation, Stratocruiser, and later piston airliners offered more seats, longer range, better cabins, and greater reliability. Air travel still had glamour. Passengers dressed well, meals were served with ceremony. Cabins were quieter than before, though still noisy by modern standards. Flight attendants represented hospitality as much as safety. Airline advertising promised not merely transportation, but a modern way of life. Yet beneath the elegance was an industrial fact. This passenger revolution depended on wartime foundations. Without mass production, aircraft would have remained too scarce and expensive. Without wartime engine development, long-range airliners would have been less capable. Without trained crews, airlines would have struggled to expand. Without better airports, larger aircraft could not have operated widely. Without radar and traffic control, the crowded post-war sky would have become more dangerous. Without military transport experience, airlines would have lacked proven models for long-distance route operations. The post-war passenger did not board a bomber, but he boarded the world the bomber had helped create. That is the paradox at the heart of this story. A war machine helped build a civilian freedom. The technology of conflict became the technology of reunion, business, vacation, diplomacy, and national growth. The same industrial strength that carried America through war helped carry Americans into the modern age of travel. The immediate post-war airline world still belonged largely to piston engines and propellers, but the jet age was already waiting. During World War II, jet propulsion emerged as a military technology. Germany and Britain moved early. The United States pursued its own programs, with NACA and industry working to understand and improve early jet engines. At first, jets were not obvious commercial machines. They consumed fuel heavily. They required new materials, new maintenance practices, new airport planning, new safety thinking, and new pilot training. Early commercial jet service began outside the United States, most famously with the British de Havilland Comet. Its early promise was followed by tragedy, investigation, redesign, and hard lessons about metal fatigue and pressurized fuselages. But the direction of history was clear. Speed mattered, altitude mattered, passenger time mattered, and the technologies that had been accelerated by war, high-speed aerodynamics, turbine engines, pressurization, radar, long runways, instrument flying, and global navigation, all converged in the jet airliner. When the Boeing 707 entered service, it did not come from nowhere. It came from decades of American aircraft production. It came from wartime bomber experience. It came from military jet research. It came from swept-wing studies, turbine development, high-altitude flight, and the confidence of an aerospace industry built under wartime pressure. The jet age changed everything. It made oceans smaller. It made coast-to-coast travel faster. It moved international travel from luxury elite experience toward mass transportation. But the roots of that age reached back into the factories and laboratories of World War II. The post-war sky was not simply invented in peace. It was forged in war, refined in peace, and then transformed again by the jet. The story of post-war aviation is often told through airplanes. The DC-4, the Constellation, the Stratocruiser, the DC-6, the Super Constellation, the Boeing 707. But the deeper story is not only about aircraft models. It is about capacity, a nation's ability to build, a nation's ability to organize, a nation's ability to learn under pressure and then convert that learning into prosperity. World War II forced the United States to mobilize science, labor, capital, industry, government, and military planning on a scale never seen before. That mobilization produced weapons, yes, but it also produced systems. Systems of research, systems of production, systems of airport planning, systems of maintenance, systems of training, systems of navigation and control. After 1945, those systems did not vanish. They became part of the architecture of American power in peace. Civil aviation became one expression of that architecture. Airlines connected cities, airports anchored regional economies. Aircraft manufacturing became one of the nation's great advanced industries. Aviation jobs supported communities. Air travel changed business, family life, tourism, diplomacy, and the American sense of distance. For older Americans, this story carries a particular emotional weight. It is the story of a country that built under pressure, a country that asked ordinary citizens to do extraordinary work, a country where factory floors, drafting rooms, air bases, and control towers became part of a national effort. And then, after victory, that effort helped create a civilian world of movement and opportunity. The legacy of World War II in civil aviation is not only found in museums. It is found every time a passenger aircraft climbs through the clouds. It is found in the airport runway lights at night. It is found in the voice of an air traffic controller guiding an aircraft home. It is found in the expectation that a person can wake up in one American city and sleep that night in another, thousands of miles away. That expectation was built. It was engineered. It was paid for by labor, risk, sacrifice, and imagination. And much of it was born in the industrial furnace of World War II. In war, aviation helped defend freedom. In peace, aviation helped express it. The freedom to travel, the freedom to trade, the freedom to visit family across the continent, the freedom to see the world, the freedom to connect distant places with speed and confidence. The airplanes changed. The paint schemes changed. The terminals changed. The engines changed from pistons to turbines, from propellers to jets. But beneath the polished skin of post-war civil aviation lay a wartime inheritance. Factories that learned speed, engineers who learned courage, pilots who learned distance, mechanics who learned reliability, controllers who learned vigilance, a nation that learned what it could build when history demanded everything. World War II did not create commercial aviation by itself, but it gave it scale. It gave it urgency. It gave it technology. It gave it people. It gave it infrastructure. And it gave the United States a place at the center of the modern sky. So the next time we see an airliner climbing above the clouds, it is worth remembering that its story began long before the boarding gate. It began in the roar of radial engines, in the glow of factory lights, in the hands of workers on the night shift, in the calculations of engineers, in the courage of crews, and in a nation determined to build not only for victory, but for the future that would come after it. That future became the post-war sky, and America helped build it.